I remember the first time I realized the ocean doesn't just swallow you, it remembers you. Far below the surface, in the Mariana Trench, I found myself surrounded by shadows that moved like they had a mind of their own. There were 11 strange rules I had to follow to survive down here. Rules that seemed absurd until they became the only things keeping me from vanishing entirely. I heard something brush against my suit, and I knew if I broke just one rule, I might never see daylight again. What was out there, waiting for me? I couldn't even begin to guess. The moment I climbed into the submersible, I remembered Rule 1, never touch what touches you first. It had been drilled into us during training, but I never imagined I would feel the weight of it this deep in the Mariana Trench. The water pressed in from every side, black and suffocating, and I could hear my own heartbeat bouncing in my ears. I watched the delicate instruments on the dashboard vibrate slightly, as if reacting to something unseen lurking outside. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just nerves, just isolation, just the ocean playing tricks. The hatch sealed behind me with a hiss that sounded final, like the world above had been locked away forever. The small cabin was dim, the only light coming from the panels and the faint green glow from the porthole. I could barely see the outline of my partner, Marcus, sitting across from me, tapping at the controls nervously. "You really think these rules matter?" he whispered. I swallowed hard, remembering Rule 1 again, forcing a calm tone. "They're the only things keeping us alive, Marcus. Just follow them." The submersible began to descend, a slow, grinding movement that made the cabin creak in protest. Outside the viewport, the darkness swallowed the blue light of the surface in an instant. Shadows stretched in impossible ways, moving along with us, or maybe independently. I couldn't tell. I could feel a presence, something brushing the hull, testing, nudging, and my skin crawled. I forced myself not to touch it. Rule 1 demanded I wait, no matter how instinctively I wanted to shove back against the pressure or the brush. Hours passed, though it could have been minutes or days. The abyss has no clock. Marcus kept muttering about how the instruments were showing movement outside, something alive and enormous. I kept reminding myself of Rule 1, gripping the console, biting back a question, biting back the instinct to reach out and prod the strange forms pressing against the submersible. The water's current shifted suddenly, and I felt a hand, or something like a hand, slide along the metal outside the porthole. I told myself it couldn't be real, that it had to be a reflection, but my own pulse betrayed me. When we reached the first trench plateau, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A massive shadow moved beneath us, its shape flickering like a mirage, limbs that didn't make sense, and I could see it lingering near the sub. Marcus leaned forward, curiosity fighting fear. "Should we?" he started, but I cut him off with a sharp glance. Rule 1 flashed in my mind like a warning light. "Never engage, never touch first," I whispered. "If we break it, we don't get a second chance." His eyes widened, and he fell silent, swallowed by the darkness. The trench walls were jagged, rising like ancient teeth from the ocean floor, and the submersible rocked slightly as currents forced us sideways. Every creak, every groan of the metal hull made me flinch, imagining the shadow brushing against it, testing, watching, calculating. I remembered Rule 1 again, feeling the weight of obedience pressing down harder than the ocean above. I could see Marcus's hand twitching near the console, itching to do something reckless, and I had to physically place my hand over his. "Don't," I hissed. "It's the first thing you touch that kills." Hours, or maybe it was moments later, the shadow returned, larger, closer, moving with a fluidity that made my stomach turn. I tried to focus on the gauges, pretending they were more important than the sensation of being studied from all sides. I could feel every vibration, every pulse of water, and I remembered the old stories, whispered among divers. The first touch isn't just contact, it's a bond. Rule 1 wasn't arbitrary, it was survival. You touch it, or it touches you, and there's no coming back from the one who makes the first move. Marcus broke the silence eventually, whispering about shapes forming near the floor of the trench, creatures he couldn't identify, and I could hear the tremor in his voice. I kept repeating Rule 1 in my head, like a mantra, reminding myself that we weren't here to explore or catalog, we were here to survive. If it reaches us first, don't, I said firmly. His breathing was ragged, but he nodded, finally understanding the gravity, the invisible barrier set by a rule that seemed insane, until it saved your life. By the time we reached the first observation point, the shadow had grown more persistent, brushing repeatedly along the sub's side. I could see it now, clearer, long limbs stretching in ways that should have been impossible, eyes, or something like eyes, glinting from the void. Every instinct screamed to react, to touch, to push, but I forced myself to obey. Rule 1 whispered in my mind with each pulse of fear, never ever touch what touches you first. My hands shook, but I kept them where they were, and for now, the shadow seemed to recede, testing patience like a predator. I remembered the old diver who trained us, his voice gravelly and urgent, telling stories of crews that didn't obey the first rule. They went quiet, one by one, he had said. I could almost hear him now, echoing through the empty cabin. Rule 1 wasn't just a guideline, it was a commandment forged in the deep, written in the experiences of those who had vanished beneath the pressure. I whispered to Marcus, "You feel that? It's waiting. It knows. If you touch first, we're done." He nodded, his lips tight, eyes wide, haunted by the silent promise outside our hull. Then without warning, something slammed against the sub from beneath, and the entire cabin shuddered violently. Instruments rattled, lights flickered, and my stomach lurched as the pressure seemed to push against my chest. I clenched my fists, recalling Rule 1, trying to anchor myself in the simple act of restraint. Marcus's hand twitched again, and I gripped his arm firmly. "Do nothing. Wait," I hissed, voice barely audible over the groaning metal. The shadow pulsed against us, as if testing boundaries, and I felt the first real taste of fear that had nothing to do with water or depth. It was the fear of breaking the rule. Time became meaningless as we hovered, waiting, every second stretching into eternity. The sub's hull groaned under pressures that should have bent it in half, and I could feel something pressing closer, studying, tasting, calculating. I repeated Rule 1 over and over, a lifeline in the darkness. The presence outside tested us again, wrapping around the hull in invisible coils, yet neither of us moved. One wrong gesture, one impulsive act, and I knew survival wouldn't be an option. It was patience, restraint, and obedience that might let us see daylight again. By the time the shaking subsided, I realized how close we had come to disaster. My hands were numb from tension, my mind racing, but I repeated Rule 1 in relief, grateful we hadn't yielded. Marcus looked at me with a mixture of awe and terror. "I don't know how you did it," he whispered. I shook my head, knowing it wasn't skill, it was survival instinct guided by the first rule, the one that would echo in every decision we made down here. And yet, even as I told myself we were safe, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the abyss had more tests waiting for us, each more dangerous than the last. The shadow receded only slightly, leaving us with an eerie calm that pressed on my chest like the weight of the trench itself. I knew now that the first rule had kept us alive, but the moment we dared to relax, the darkness seemed to thicken, curling around the sub like smoke. That's when I remembered Rule 2. Always keep your lights on, even when darkness tempts you. The faint glow of the instrument panels was no longer enough. I had to push the main lights higher, to cut through the oppressive black that felt alive with watching eyes. Marcus hesitated, staring out at the abyss, murmuring about how tempting it was to dim the lights, to let the sub blend into the dark. "It's just a little dark, we won't be seen," he whispered, voice tight with fear and fascination. I grabbed his arm and squeezed. "No, Rule 2 exists for a reason. Darkness isn't just empty down here, it's hunting." I could hear the water shift outside, the brushing movements persistent, almost impatient. The lights didn't just illuminate, they were a barrier, a thin membrane between us and whatever waited beyond our hull. As we descended deeper, the shadows pressed closer, their forms almost teasing the edges of the viewport. I forced myself to keep the beam steady, watching every subtle ripple and pulse. Rule 2 was alive in my mind, a constant warning that to give in to the temptation of darkness was to surrender control, and perhaps life itself. Marcus kept fidgeting, struggling between awe and terror. I could feel his curiosity battling the instinct to obey, and I gritted my teeth. "It watches for weakness," I said, voice low. "If we turn off the lights, it finds us." The abyss became a canvas for things I could barely comprehend. Streaks of movement, elongated forms that twisted in ways no animal should, moved just beyond the reach of our beams. I remembered the diver before me, who ignored the lights once, thinking it harmless, and the story ended with silence. Only a floating suit recovered later. I could almost see him in my mind, a warning carved into memory. Rule 2 was not a suggestion. Darkness tempted with mystery, but it hid the rules of death in every shadow. Marcus swallowed hard, finally admitting, "I can't stop looking at it. I can't stop wondering what's out there." I kept my gaze forward, hands gripping the controls. "Then you need to trust the rules," I said, repeating Rule 2 to anchor both of us. A sudden lurch sent the sub tilting, the shadows outside flickering faster, and I realized the lights weren't just for us, they were a shield. I could feel the water pressing like invisible fingers, brushing against the sub, testing reactions, probing the boundaries we were forced to maintain. Hours passed in a tense rhythm. Every adjustment of the sub's lights, every flicker of shadows kept my mind sharp and trembling. Rule 2 had a subtle cruelty. It demanded constant attention. Even a single second of dimming could be fatal. I caught Marcus nearly reaching to turn off one of the auxiliary lights, mesmerized by the void, and I yanked his hand away. "Don't," I growled. "Do you want to see what happens when the darkness wins?" The water shifted like a living entity, and I could feel the answer pressing against us without words. We were forced into a narrow canyon of rock and pressure, the sub barely scraping the jagged walls, and the shadows outside moved as if following our every inch. I held the light steady, a thin trembling barrier between us and whatever was observing. I whispered Rule 2 again, almost as a spell. "No matter how safe it looks, we never give in. Darkness doesn't forgive curiosity." Marcus nodded, trembling, finally understanding that the temptation of darkness was not natural, it was predatory. Every flicker, every dim moment, could be a signal to the abyss to strike. Then the sub jolted violently. One of the external lights flickered, a momentary stutter, and panic clawed at me. I slammed the backup switch, forcing the beam to flare at full intensity, cutting the black into neat, fragile wedges. I could feel the pressure outside, the brushing against the hull, like tentative fingers testing the limits. Rule 2 burned in my mind. Always keep the lights on, even when darkness tempts you. If we faltered, even for a heartbeat, we could become nothing more than another story whispered among divers. A low vibration ran through the cabin, subtle, almost like the ocean itself was breathing, and I knew the shadows were circling us. I kept the lights at full power, my eyes darting across every panel, every corner of the viewport. Marcus tried to whisper questions, but I hushed him. "Do not look away, do not dim them. Rule 2 exists for survival, nothing else." I could feel his pulse racing against my own, a shared rhythm of terror and obedience. The abyss waited, patient and endless, but for now, the lights kept the worst at bay. Finally, we reached a plateau where the darkness seemed to stretch infinitely below. The sub rocked gently, as if the water itself were sighing. I didn't dare turn down a single light. Rule 2 was more than survival, it was sanity, a fragile grip on reality, where everything else was alien, unfeeling and hungry. Marcus stared at the shadows beyond the beams, his eyes wide and hollow, but he obeyed. "I get it," he whispered. "I won't turn them off." I nodded, though deep down I knew that somewhere further below, deeper than either of us could imagine, the real tests were just beginning. and the abyss was far from done. Even with the lights burning steadily, the silence of the trench pressed on us like a living thing. I remembered Rule 3, never speak. When something is near, though the idea seemed almost impossible at first. The sub hummed around us, mechanical and fragile, while shadows twisted beyond the viewport, moving in ways that defied logic. Every time I inhaled, I imagined the water carrying sound like a predator, listening for even the slightest whisper. Marcus's eyes kept flicking toward the darkness, full of unspoken questions, and I had to bite my tongue to keep him silent. We drifted along a jagged ridge where the abyss opened into an impossibly deep canyon, and I could feel the pressure intensify as if the ocean itself were leaning closer. I reminded Marcus again about Rule 3, whispering so quietly it barely disturbed the cabin's air. If it hears us, even the softest word, it knows where to strike, I said. He nodded, jaw tight, lips pressed together. Outside, the shadows pulsed, stretching toward us, teasing our perception, their movements almost synchronized with the rhythm of our own anxious hearts. A sudden scrape of metal along the hull made me flinch, and I could see Marcus stiffen beside me. I forced myself to keep my voice down, repeating Rule 3 in my head like a mantra. We couldn't communicate now, except through the smallest gestures and subtle glances, every movement carefully measured. I realized the rule was more than caution. It was a lifeline. The trench didn't care about fear or logic. It only responded to sound, and sound was deadly when it was carried far enough in the black water. Marcus tried to point towards something outside the viewport, his fingers trembling, but I shook my head sharply. Rule 3 demanded absolute silence, even in the face of the unimaginable. The shadow shifted closer, brushing along the sub like testing fingers, probing the limits of our restraint. I could feel the vibration in the hull, subtle and insistent, and my stomach knotted as I imagined what would happen if a single word slipped. The water carried everything here, and I knew even a whisper could mean death. Time stretched endlessly, the abyss unchanging, yet alive with anticipation. Every minute was torture, a test of restraint, a battle between instinct and survival. I kept the sub moving slowly, never making sudden sounds, while Marcus mimicked my measured breathing. I repeated Rule 3 silently, letting it anchor both of us, a lifeline amid the shadows that danced along the hull. Something large moved beneath us, its presence almost palpable, and I realized the silence itself was our shield. The trench seemed to narrow, walls of rock and sediment pressing closer, constricting the space around us. I could feel the shadows outside shifting with each millimeter, and I remembered the stories from other divers' crews, who laughed or muttered down here, didn't last long. I gripped the controls, jaw tight, repeating Rule 3 internally, as a reminder that the smallest sound could turn this from observation to carnage. Marcus's hand hovered near the console, poised to speak, and I gave him a sharp glance, his lips pressed together, finally obeying. Then, without warning, the sub jolted again, a sudden downward sweep that made us press against our harnesses. My heart raced, and I could feel the vibration of something massive moving below, brushing against the hull with deliberate force. Rule 3 screamed in my mind, never ever speak, even thinking it felt dangerous, as if the shadows could hear intention. I clenched my hands around the controls, teeth grinding, eyes scanning every inch of the viewport for signs that the presence had grown impatient. Marcus swallowed audibly, and I could see his panic rising, but he didn't speak. We were both prisoners of the rule, trapped in an invisible cage of obedience. The shadows seemed to linger longer near the hull, testing, waiting, almost enjoying our restraint. I whispered to myself, remembering the older divers' warnings. The trench didn't just consume the body, it tested the mind, and a single sound could unbalance both. Rule 3 wasn't just survival, it was a pact with the abyss, a contract enforced by creatures we couldn't understand. Hours, or perhaps mere minutes, passed in rigid, suffocating silence. The shadows eventually drifted just beyond the reach of our lights, but I couldn't relax. Rule 3 demanded vigilance, even when the immediate threat seemed to vanish. I glanced at Marcus, his hands clammy and trembling, and I nodded slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement that we had survived this round. But deep down, I knew the next challenge would be more insidious, testing not only our obedience, but our very instincts. The trench waited, patient, unseen, and relentless. I couldn't shake the feeling that the abyss was learning us, watching how tightly we clung to the rules, waiting for the moment we faltered. Rule 3 wasn't just about silence. It was about understanding the rhythm of survival, the subtle dance between predator and prey, beneath crushing pressure. Even as the shadows seemed to recede, the memory of their presence lingered, a warning that obedience alone was never enough. We had passed the first test of restraint, but the darkness was far from satisfied, and I knew the next rule would demand even more from us, even deeper below the surface. The shadow finally drifted, just beyond the glow of our lights, leaving a quiet that felt almost unnatural. I reminded myself again of Rule 4. Never turn your back on the abyss. The fourth rule etched into my mind with every pulse of fear. Even the faintest movement, outside the viewport, could conceal something impossible, something that thrived in patience. Marcus shifted nervously in his seat, and I caught the tremor in his hands as he adjusted the controls. I gritted my teeth, forcing my gaze back toward the unknown, unwilling to let even a moment of complacency tempt me. The trench walls curved around us, jagged and unforgiving, while shadows flickered with the currents, teasing the edges of our lights. I could feel the sub creaking under pressure, the hull groaning as though it knew what lurked beyond. Rule 4 had never felt more urgent. It wasn't just about survival, it was about maintaining constant awareness. Marcus tried to glance away for just a second, following a fleeting shadow to the rear of the cabin, and I snapped, "Don't, never turn away. The abyss doesn't forgive mistakes." His eyes widened, but he kept his focus forward. Something brushed against the hull again, low and deliberate, making the sub tilt slightly. I could feel it moving with intent, testing, weighing our reactions, and I gritted my teeth. Rule 4 echoed in my mind, sharper than ever. To turn our back, even for a second, would be to invite disaster. The abyss had patience that no human could match, and I realized how close we had been to inviting it in with the smallest lapse of attention. Every glance I took away from the viewport felt like a betrayal of my own survival instinct. Marcus finally whispered, breaking the silence with a quivering voice, "What if it's everywhere? What if we can't see it all?" I tightened my grip on the controls and repeated Rule 4 aloud, "Then we never turn our back. That's the only way to survive." The shadows seemed to respond, flowing around the sub like smoke in slow motion. I could feel a presence pressing closer, a weight in the water that was almost tangible, and I realized that the abyss didn't just test your courage, it tested your attention, your discipline, the sharpness of your instinct. As we descended further into the trench, the walls seemed to close in slightly, like a living entity, and the shadows became more aggressive, brushing in and out of the light's reach. Every movement outside the viewport made me tense, heart hammering, hands clammy on the console. I repeated Rule 4 over and over, willing it into both of us. Never turn away, never lose focus. The water outside seemed to pulse with life, or at least something pretending to be life, testing the limits of our fear and obedience. Marcus flinched as a faint movement streaked past the rear viewport, a shape too large and too fluid to be human. I turned slightly, just enough to glance, and felt panic spike as the rule hammered in my mind. Rule 4 forbade me from breaking focus. I forced myself to look straight ahead again, controlling the sub with trembling precision. The water pressed heavier now, the shadows twisting and lingering in ways that defied logic. I could feel them brushing closer to the back, testing, waiting for any sign of weakness. The sub's instruments began picking up faint pulses, irregular and large, far too rhythmic to be natural. I realized the abyss had a presence that extended beyond sight, and Rule 4 demanded I respect it. Any lapse, any glance away, might have consequences we couldn't even imagine. Marcus's breathing was shallow and fast, but he kept silent, following my lead. I knew he was learning quickly, that rules weren't suggestions here. They were contracts written in the language of survival. I could feel the pressure increasing, subtle at first, then suddenly heavier, as if the water itself were aware of our small transgression. Shadows outside flickered again, closer now, testing boundaries, and I realized the abyss had a memory. It remembered every look away, every hesitation, every lapse. I tightened my grip, reminding myself that Rule 4 was not just awareness, it was vigilance. The smallest moment of distraction could give the shadows the opening they were waiting for, and I couldn't risk it. Hours blurred together, and the sub moved like a fragile vessel in an endless void. I repeated Rule 4 silently, scanning, watching, forcing Marcus to do the same. Every twitch of light, every pulse of movement outside was a threat, and I knew we weren't merely observing. We were being observed, measured, tested. The abyss had patience, and we had only rules to cling to. As we hovered over a deeper trench, I felt a shift in the water, subtle but deliberate, and I knew the next rule would demand even more than our eyes and hands. The darkness wasn't finished with us yet. The shadows outside had receded slightly, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating, as if the water itself were a living thing observing our every move. I reminded myself again of Rule 5. Never attempt to communicate with what you cannot see. The rule I had initially dismissed as paranoia until now. Every subtle vibration, every ripple along the hull felt like an invitation to reach out, to respond, and I forced myself to resist. The abyss didn't understand words, and it certainly didn't negotiate. Marcus shifted nervously, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the viewport, his lips parting as though to ask a question. I caught him before he could speak. "Don't," I hissed, voice tight with fear. It can hear intention, even thought. "You have to obey Rule 5. His jaw tightened, and he nodded, swallowing down the panic that threatened to spill over. I realized that communicating with the unknown wasn't just foolish, it was fatal. The ocean here was too vast, too deep, and the shadows outside were too alive, responding to stimuli we couldn't perceive. It was patience, invisibility, and silence that might let us survive, nothing else. The sub hummed along the edge of another trench plateau, its metal hull shivering under the pressure, and I could sense the shadows moving again, brushing just outside our lights. I felt the irresistible urge to gesture, to flash a light, to try and see if it would respond, but Rule 5 held me frozen. Communication here was a trap. The abyss didn't reciprocate, it tested, it measured, it waited. Any attempt to reach out could invite death, and I felt Marcus's tension pressing against my side as he struggled with the same instinct. Suddenly, a strange pulse ran through the hull, almost like a rhythm in the water, deliberate and taunting. I pressed my hands to the controls, repeating Rule 5 in my head. The shadow had initiated something we couldn't understand, and my survival depended on ignoring the impulse to reply. The darkness outside twisted in fluid, impossible ways, stretching and contorting with intent. I realized it was learning from us, and even the smallest attempt to communicate, curiosity, fear, or empathy, could give it a foothold we couldn't recover from. Hours passed in rigid, tense observation. The shadows pressed closer, always at the edge of visibility, their movements synchronized with the thrum of the sub's engines. Marcus's breathing was shallow, lips moving silently, and I understood he was repeating Rule 5 to himself. The trench demanded obedience, not just of actions, but of thoughts, a discipline I could barely maintain. Every instinct screamed to respond, to wave, to signal, and I clenched my jaw, forcing the sub forward slowly, never engaging, never acknowledging. I caught glimpses of shapes that could not be real, elongated forms coiling, spiraling, stretching in ways that defied physics. My heart raced, but I knew Rule 5 demanded I stay silent, stay passive. The abyss was testing us, gauging reactions, and any hint of recognition could be catastrophic. Marcus nearly gasped, a reflexive sound caught in his throat, and I had to press my hand against his arm to steady him. "No, Rule 5. I whispered. Do not acknowledge, do not respond. We survive by restraint. The sub's instruments began picking up faint signals, patterns in the currents that felt like intentional pulses. I resisted the urge to interpret them, to attempt some form of understanding. Rule 5 burned in my mind. The moment we reach out, the moment we try to speak to the abyss, we risk becoming prey. I could feel the shadows outside, larger now, moving like deliberate observers, and the sub's metal shuddered under their presence. It was a cruel patience, a predator playing with prey, testing limits we could barely comprehend. Hours, or perhaps it was only minutes, stretched into a blur. The darkness pressed closer, and I could sense the pressure shifting, the shadows coiling and retreating in response to our restraint. Rule 5 was no longer advice. It was instinct, etched into every nerve. I had to focus on the controls, on the lights, on the vibration of the sub under the water, and do nothing else. Marcus mimicked my movements, his eyes wide, understanding that to survive, we had to ignore curiosity, ignore questions, ignore everything the abyss seemed to offer. Suddenly, one of the shadows surged forward, brushing along the sub violently enough to make the cabin tremble. My stomach lurched, and I could feel Marcus stiffen beside me. I whispered Rule 5 like a lifeline, reminding both of us to stay silent, to let the shadow pass without acknowledgement. It lingered, testing, probing, and then retreated, but the message was clear. The abyss didn't forgive communication. The next misstep, the next sound, even a whisper, could end everything. As we drifted into the deeper black, farther than either of us had ever imagined, I realized that Rule 5 was more than survival. It was understanding the limits of human control. The abyss was patient, deliberate, alive in ways we couldn't see, and I understood that ignoring it, refusing to communicate, was the only thing keeping us tethered to life. Yet I knew the next rule would test us in ways even this restraint could not prepare us for. The trench waited patiently, and we were far from safe. The sub's hull groaned again, a low, almost deliberate vibration that made my skin crawl, and I immediately remembered Rule 6. Never ignore the sounds of the hull. Every creak, every subtle pulse of metal against water carried meaning in these depths, a language we weren't meant to fully understand. I pressed my hands firmly against the console, listening, analyzing, terrified that even a single misinterpretation could doom us. Marcus glanced nervously toward the porthole, but I shook my head, forcing him to pay attention to the rhythm of the sub, not the shadows outside. The pressure seemed to intensify with every passing second, and the hull's vibrations became more insistent, almost communicating with a presence we couldn't see. I tried to ignore the instinctive urge to panic, focusing instead on every subtle nuance in the hum and groan of the metal. Rule 6 was clear. The abyss used sound as a weapon, as a signal, as a way to test obedience. Any negligence, any distraction, could be fatal. I could feel Marcus's tension pressing against my shoulder, mirroring my own anxiety, and I reminded him to listen carefully, to trust the rule. A sudden thrum pulsed through the sub, like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, and I realized the shadow outside was moving in response to us. I clenched my jaw, repeating Rule 6 in my head like a mantra. The abyss was alive in ways we couldn't comprehend, communicating through vibration, through pressure, through subtle tremors that could unbalance both mind and body. I forced myself to focus, noting every quiver, every shiver of metal, and recording them mentally as best I could. Marcus stayed silent, finally realizing that even his slightest exhale might distract us from survival. The sub drifted along a narrow canyon wall, jagged rocks scraping near the hull, yet the sounds I was hearing were more subtle, foreign, unnatural. My heartbeat quickened, but I refused to let panic dictate action. Rule 6 wasn't about ignoring fear, it was about interpreting it. Every vibration, every distant hum, was a piece of the puzzle, a way to navigate the abyss without falling victim to it. I whispered to Marcus, "Focus on the hull, listen. Every sound has meaning. His eyes widened as he adjusted his position, listening intently. Suddenly, the hull groaned louder, a rolling vibration that rattled our instruments. I froze, muscles tensing, and remembered divers' warnings. Crews who ignored these subtle messages never returned. Rule 6 demanded vigilance. It required you to interpret the ocean's language, the whispers of pressure and friction, and act accordingly. I could feel the presence outside, testing, circling, pressing, and I knew that failure to heed the sounds could give it an opening. Marcus's hand hovered near the controls, but I stopped him firmly, forcing him to stay alert, to observe, to feel the pulse of metal like our only tether to life. The vibration shifted, uneven and irregular, and I realized it was not random. The abyss was communicating, or at least signaling. I had to stay calm, document every subtle change, every minute quiver of the hull. Rule 6 demanded absolute attention, a discipline that was almost painful to maintain under such stress. Outside, shadows flickered with the rhythm of the vibrations, moving closer in ways that seemed impossible. I clenched my hands tightly on the controls, forcing Marcus to do the same, both of us trembling but silent, obeying the rule that could mean the difference between life and death. Hours, or perhaps mere moments, passed with the sub shuddering under invisible pressure. I repeated Rule 6 internally, memorizing each vibration, each pulse, until my muscles ached and my mind screamed. The shadows outside tested our patience, brushing along the hull in teasing strokes that set every nerve on edge. Marcus finally whispered, "I think it knows we're listening," and I nodded without looking away from the viewport. Rule 6 wasn't about fear, it was about awareness, understanding, and acknowledging that the abyss had a mind of its own, capable of manipulating both perception and reality. A sudden thud rattled the sub violently, like a fist striking metal, and I felt my stomach drop. The shadow had made contact, deliberate, probing, and I repeated Rule 6 aloud as a warning, forcing both of us to remain vigilant. The sub groaned again, responding to the pressure outside, and I realized that the abyss had patience, but it also had intent. Listening was survival, understanding the rhythm was survival, and ignoring the smallest signal was a fatal error. Marcus's face paled, eyes wide, finally comprehending the deadly weight of the rule. By the time the shaking subsided, I was drenched in sweat, every nerve screaming, but we had survived. Rule 6 had guided us through yet another encounter, forcing us to respect the communication of the abyss without attempting to answer. I whispered to Marcus, "This is only the beginning. There's more below, and every rule matters now more than ever." He nodded, trembling, finally understanding that every vibration, every subtle noise was not background, it was the only thing keeping us alive. We continued our descent into the trench, deeper than either of us had ever dared, the shadows lingering just beyond the lights, brushing the hull, testing, observing. Rule 6 burned in my mind, a reminder that the abyss speaks in ways we cannot fully comprehend, and ignoring its language, even for a heartbeat, could be the end. And as the sub creaked and groaned under the crushing pressure, I realized the next rule would demand more than just listening. It would demand absolute trust in what we couldn't see. The vibrations finally subsided, leaving a suffocating silence that pressed against the sub like a living weight. I reminded myself of Rule 7, never let curiosity guide you, though the temptation to peek, to probe, to understand the shadows outside, was almost unbearable. The abyss seemed to pulse with intelligence, moving with deliberate purpose just beyond our lights. I clenched the controls, forcing my mind away from the questions gnawing at me. Marcus's eyes flicked toward the viewport, betraying the same curiosity I struggled to suppress, and I gave him a sharp glance to keep him focused. We drifted along a narrow canyon wall, the water pressing heavier than before, and the shadows outside seemed to react to even the smallest flicker of light. I could feel the urge to track them, to follow, to try to understand what they were. But Rule 7 was a strict warning, a lifeline in the crushing black. Curiosity had no place here. Every instinct to look closer, to interact, to interpret, could draw attention, and the abyss was patient, waiting for missteps. I reminded Marcus with a whispered, "We survive by ignoring it. Nothing else matters." Suddenly, a shape flickered across the viewport, fluid and elongated, moving impossibly fast, and I felt my heart hammer. The impulse to follow it, to flash a light, to react in any way surged in me. But Rule 7 slammed into my mind, a lifeline wrapped around fear: never let curiosity guide you. I forced my eyes forward, ignoring the impossible movements outside, focusing on the controls, on the sub, on survival. Marcus mirrored my actions, jaw tight, hands trembling, but obedient. The abyss seemed to thicken, the shadows pressing closer to the hull, brushing against it, as though testing our restraint. I could feel the pressure increasing, subtle and deliberate, almost as if the water itself were alive and aware of our thoughts. Rule 7 became a mantra. Curiosity kills here. It lures you into the unknown. It hands your life over to something beyond comprehension. I repeated it silently, willing both myself and Marcus to ignore the temptation to explore the impossible shapes outside the viewport. Hours or perhaps minutes passed in suffocating silence. The shadows danced just beyond the edge of the lights, twisting in impossible ways, daring us to react. I could feel the pull of curiosity, the need to understand, to seek patterns, but I clenched my teeth and reminded myself that obedience was survival. Rule 7 wasn't about fear, it was about discipline, about suppressing the natural human instinct that could destroy you in seconds. Marcus swallowed hard, finally realizing that looking too long, thinking too deeply, could make us prey. Suddenly, a pulse ran through the hull, a deliberate vibration that seemed almost like a message, or a trap. My fingers trembled over the controls as I forced myself to stay forward, obeying Rule 7. The shadow outside twisted and stretched, its movements unnerving, almost hypnotic, as if trying to lure us into engagement. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the urge to respond or investigate. Curiosity here wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. One glance, one question, one impulse could undo everything we had survived so far. The trench walls narrowed again, jagged and cruel, scraping past the sub as we drifted cautiously. I reminded Marcus quietly, "Do not look away. Do not think about it. Curiosity kills." He nodded, lips pressed tight, understanding finally that Rule 7 was more than a suggestion. It was a boundary, the line between life and death. Outside, shadows twisted in ways no human eye should comprehend, testing us, studying us, waiting for a single moment of weakness. I felt a cold dread settle over me, knowing the abyss was patient enough to wait for our minds to betray us. Another sudden pressure spike made the sub tilt slightly, and I could feel the shadows pressing along the hull like invisible fingers. The impulse to track, to see, to interact, surged stronger than ever. I gritted my teeth, whispering Rule 7 under my breath, reminding both of us that restraint was our only option. The darkness waited, unblinking, eternal, its intentions impossible to guess. Every instinct we had screamed to follow the shapes, to investigate, to understand, but we obeyed the rule and survived. For now, by the time the sub stabilized, I realized the abyss had tested our minds, gauging not just our obedience but our curiosity. Rule 7 had saved us, forcing our attention back to survival instead of understanding. Marcus exhaled shakily, finally realizing the weight of the rule. Outside, the shadows lingered, patient, observing, as if cataloging our restraint for the next test. And I knew deep in my bones that the next rule would demand even more control, more focus, more endurance than we had yet been forced to summon. Even as the shadows outside twisted and disappeared into the depths, I reminded myself of Rule 8, always keep your distance from unknown creatures. The trench was alive with things I couldn't begin to understand, moving just beyond the reach of our lights, and every instinct screamed to look closer, to study them. I gripped the controls, forcing Marcus to do the same, suppressing the urge to approach anything that could be dangerous. Curiosity had nearly killed us before, Now restraint became a physical necessity, a barrier between life and death in the black water. The sub drifted along a jagged shelf, rocks scraping past the hull as the shadows outside shifted in fluid patterns. I could sense something enormous nearby, brushing against the darkness in ways that made my stomach tighten. Rule 8 burned in my mind. Distance was survival. The smaller creatures, the flickers of light, even the shapes that seemed almost like limbs, all could be deadly if approached. I whispered to Marcus, "Don't even think about touching it. Keep your distance. Trust me." He nodded, trembling, eyes wide with understanding and fear. Suddenly, a massive shadow flickered just beyond the light beam, moving with deliberate intent, almost as if testing us. I could feel the pulse of water around the sub, vibrations that seemed to synchronize with some unseen heartbeat. Rule 8 became a mantra. Any proximity could be lethal. Even our curiosity had to be tempered by distance. Our every movement cautious, deliberate, measured. Marcus clenched the console, silent, eyes glued to the lights, as I forced myself to observe without engaging, to measure without interacting. The abyss seemed to pulse with life, the shadows outside coiling like immense serpents. I could feel the presence of something massive, something intelligent, just beyond the reach of the lights. Rule 8 reminded me that the smaller we kept ourselves, the safer we were. Every instinct I had urged me to shine a light brighter, to move closer, to investigate, but survival demanded restraint. I could see Marcus trembling, nearly reaching toward the viewport, and I had to press his hand firmly to stop him. "Distance," I whispered. Nothing more. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, intense observation. The shapes outside seemed to study us as much as we studied them, a predator and prey dynamic that we barely understood. Rule 8 demanded patience, discipline, and absolute adherence. Even a fraction of curiosity or misjudgment could draw the attention of something powerful enough to crush our fragile vessel. I felt the sub quiver as though the water itself were alive, a reminder that proximity could mean death. Then a shadow surged forward, brushing against the hull with enough force to make the cabin shiver. I froze, heart hammering, and repeated Rule 8 aloud, forcing both myself and Marcus to remember that engagement was forbidden. The sub trembled under the pressure, and I could feel the creature testing the boundaries of our obedience. Every fiber of my being screamed to retaliate, to react, to shine the lights brighter, but I didn't. Survival demanded distance. Obedience demanded restraint. Marcus whispered, trembling, "It's so close, I can't even see it fully." I shook my head, eyes glued to the viewport, repeating Rule 8 again. We don't see it fully because we're alive. We stay distant, we survive, nothing more. The abyss seemed to pulse with awareness, coiling and twisting around the sub, waiting, watching, testing. I could feel the enormity of the creature's patience, and I realized that proximity alone was a threat as lethal as any visible attack. The sub's instruments began picking up irregular readings, pressure spikes that suggested movement of unimaginable scale outside the lights. Rule 8 demanded focus and discipline. Every vibration, every tremor treated as data, not a target for curiosity. The shadows moved with an eerie intelligence, testing us, probing the hull as if gauging how much we could withstand. Marcus finally nodded, silent, understanding the deadly weight of the rule. Never approach the unknown, never close the gap, never make the abyss more aware of your presence than it already was. By the time the sub stabilized, I was trembling, every nerve screaming from tension, every sense sharpened by fear. Rule 8 had kept us alive again, reminding us that survival was about distance, patience, and restraint. The abyss was vast, patient, and infinitely intelligent, and we were fragile intruders in its domain. I glanced at Marcus, his face pale, finally understanding that in this trench, distance was life itself, and that the next rule would demand even more endurance than we had summoned so far. The shadows had finally receded, leaving the sub in eerie, oppressive silence. I reminded myself once again of Rule 9. Never attempt to retrieve lost objects, a rule I had thought sounded obvious, until now, when even the smallest mistake could mean death. The abyss had a way of claiming anything that wandered too far, and every instinct to recover something, to investigate a floating object, could turn into a trap. I pressed my hands firmly on the console, forcing Marcus to do the same, warning him silently that survival demanded discipline above curiosity. A small glint appeared just outside the viewport, something metallic caught in the faint beam of our lights. My stomach twisted. I wanted to reach for it, to grab it, to see what it was. But Rule 9 slammed into my mind with chilling force. Attempting to retrieve anything lost in the abyss was inviting disaster. I whispered to Marcus, "We leave it. Whatever it is, it's not ours. Don't touch it. Don't even think about it." His eyes were wide with fear and desire, the struggle between instinct and obedience evident in every muscle. The glint drifted slowly, teasing us, moving in ways that seemed deliberate, almost intelligent. The urge to grab it, to understand, clawed at me, but I forced myself to repeat Rule 9 internally, using it as an anchor. The abyss didn't just hide, it punished. Lost things carried the weight of the trench's hunger, and retrieving them was a temptation too dangerous to endure. The water outside seemed to thrum with intent, brushing against the hull, reminding us that our survival depended on restraint. Marcus swallowed audibly, his fingers hovering over the controls, almost reaching toward the object, and I slammed my hand down sharply. "Do not," I hissed. "Rule 9 exists for a reason. That isn't ours. The abyss claims what it wants, and we aren't ready to bargain." The glint disappeared suddenly, vanishing into the black void beyond the viewport, and I could feel the oppressive weight of relief and lingering fear settle in the cabin. I realized that even just seeing something out there could lure you into breaking the rules, and the trench waited patiently for that mistake. Hours, or perhaps mere minutes, passed with nothing more than the occasional ripple against the hull. I could feel Marcus's tension pressing against me, as if his entire body understood the deadly weight of the rule. Rule 9 was more than just a warning. It was a survival mechanism, a guide for restraint in a place where instinct alone could kill. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every lost object could be a trap, and obedience was our only defense against what waited beyond. The abyss pulsed faintly outside, water shifting in rhythms that I could almost interpret, but I refused to. Attempting to retrieve the glint would have been fatal, and Rule 9 reminded me that restraint was sometimes harder than courage. I whispered it to myself again, forcing Marcus to repeat it silently. "Never retrieve lost objects." The sub creaked under the pressure, shadows brushing along the hull as if testing our resolve, and I felt every nerve in my body strain to maintain discipline. Another flicker appeared, this time a larger silhouette, partially obscured by rock formations. It shifted in ways that made the sub tilt slightly, and I could feel the pull of curiosity, the irresistible urge to reach, to grab, to engage. But Rule 9 screamed in my mind, "Resist." The abyss rewarded mistakes with consequences beyond human comprehension. I gritted my teeth, ignoring every instinct, keeping the lights focused, keeping my hands steady, forcing both of us to survive through patience and restraint alone. Marcus finally exhaled, the tension in his shoulders slightly easing, as he realized that obedience had kept us safe once again. Rule 9 had saved us, a reminder that life in the trench wasn't about heroics, bravery, or discovery. It was about discipline, control, and the refusal to yield to temptation. The abyss continued to shift, patient, deliberate, intelligent in ways I still didn't understand. And I knew deep down that the next rule would test not just our discipline, but our very humanity, forcing us to confront what we could and could not endure. By the time the sub stabilized, I could feel the pressure of survival bearing down on both of us. Rule 9 had kept us alive yet again, reminding us that the trench did not reward curiosity or courage. It rewarded obedience, patience, and restraint. The shadows outside lingered, stretching impossibly long and coiling around the sub like a predator savoring restraint. I glanced at Marcus, his face pale, eyes wide with comprehension, knowing that the next rule would demand even more endurance and focus than we had mustered so far. The abyss pressed around the sub, like a living entity, silent yet brimming with unseen eyes. I remembered Rule 10, never assume you are alone, and the weight of it pressed heavily on my mind. Even when the shadows seemed to retreat, the trench had a patience that mocked our assumptions. We were never truly alone. The water itself, the vibrations, the subtle shifts in the hull, everything was alive with awareness. I felt Marcus tense beside me, and I knew he too was realizing that every second of solitude was an illusion in this place. The sub drifted over a deep trench plateau, the jagged rock walls creating tunnels where shadows could hide and wait. I could feel the presence, subtle yet undeniable, brushing against the sub in ways that made my skin crawl. Rule 10 demanded constant vigilance. Even a moment of carelessness could allow something unseen to breach the thin barrier of the hull. Marcus's breathing was shallow, controlled, but I knew his mind was racing with the realization that the abyss had been watching us the entire time, learning our habits, measuring our instincts. Suddenly, a ripple of water ran along the viewport, like a hand brushing the glass, deliberate and impossibly precise. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to repeat Rule 10 in my mind, knowing that assuming we were alone could be fatal. The sub shivered under the pressure, responding to forces we couldn't fully perceive. The shadows outside twisted and pulsed, seemingly alive, and I realized the trench was patient enough to wait until we relaxed. Then strike. Obedience to this rule was not optional, it was survival. Marcus attempted to whisper, almost as if to reassure himself that we were safe, but I silenced him with a sharp glance. "We are never alone," I said, voice tight. Rule 10 wasn't about paranoia, it was a recognition of reality in these depths. The abyss was intelligent, patient, and everywhere at once. The sub groaned under the pressure, vibrations racing through the hull as if the water itself were testing our awareness, measuring our vigilance. Hours, or perhaps mere minutes, passed with the sub drifting cautiously, the shadows moving in ways that defied logic. Rule 10 anchored us. Every creak, every pulse, every subtle change in the water became vital information. I forced Marcus to keep his focus forward, to observe, to interpret, without assuming that anything we saw or didn't see was safe. The trench was a predator that demanded constant attention, and assuming we were alone was the quickest route to death. Suddenly, the sub lurched violently, as if something enormous had brushed the hull, deliberate, testing, powerful. I could feel Marcus stiffen beside me, and I repeated Rule 10 aloud, forcing us both to internalize it. We were never alone. The abyss was patient, calculating, and this contact was its way of reminding us. Every instinct screamed to react, to panic, to lash out, but we obeyed, knowing that any assumption of solitude could mean the end. The shadows outside twisted impossibly, coiling and stretching along the walls, teasing the edges of our lights. Rule 10 burned in my mind. Never trust what you see, never trust what you feel, never believe you are alone. The sub trembled under the water's pressure, responding to forces we could neither control nor comprehend. Marcus's face was pale, jaw tight, eyes wide with realization. Even the faintest lapse in awareness could be catastrophic. A sudden pulse ran through the hull, rhythmic and deliberate, as if some unseen presence was measuring our patience, our focus, our fear. I gritted my teeth, whispering Rule 10 like a mantra, forcing both of us to stay alert, to remember that solitude was an illusion. The abyss was everywhere, yet nowhere, patient and unrelenting. Any attempt to assume control, any fraction of relaxation, could invite disaster, and I could feel its intelligence testing us with every shiver of the hull. By the time the sub stabilized, I realized that obedience to Rule 10 had kept us alive yet again. The shadows lingered beyond the light, patient, aware, always observing, and I knew that assuming we were alone had nearly killed us more than once. Marcus finally exhaled, pale and trembling, the weight of understanding settling on him. And I knew deep in my bones that the next and final rule would be the most terrifying, demanding every shred of courage, focus, and discipline we had left, or we would not survive the trench at all. The shadows had receded just enough for us to breathe, but I could feel their presence lingering, waiting for the smallest lapse. I remembered Rule 11. Never let anything touch you back. The rule that no one truly survives if they ignore it. The abyss didn't just test your courage, your focus, or your restraint. It tested your very body, your instincts, and your fear. Marcus shivered beside me, eyes wide, as if even acknowledging the rule aloud might summon something unseen. I clenched my hands around the controls, repeating the words in my mind, willing them to become both shield and weapon. As we drifted along a jagged canyon wall, the pressure pressed harder, almost like fingers tracing the subsurface. I felt a pulse, subtle yet deliberate, brushing against the hull in a rhythm that seemed aware of our movements. Rule 11 screamed in my mind, never let anything touch back. Even the smallest contact could mean death. Yet the instinct to reach, to react, to fight, was almost impossible to resist. I whispered to Marcus, if it touches us, it's over. Keep your hands still, move only what you must. He nodded, lips tight, trembling, eyes locked on the shadows beyond the viewport. Suddenly, the sub jolted violently, as if something enormous had made contact, testing, probing, searching. My heart slammed against my chest, and I could feel Marcus's panic pressing against me like an electric current. Rule 11 demanded more than silence, more than restraint. It demanded control over every impulse, every reflex, every thought. The water itself seemed alive, brushing, testing, teasing, and I could feel the intelligence behind it, deliberate and cruel. Survival depended on absolute obedience, and one slip could doom us both. The shadows twisted impossibly outside, coiling around rocks, brushing along the hull, always just beyond the lights. I could feel the vibration of something massive moving, the brush of it against the sub, like fingers I couldn't see. Rule 11 anchored me, forced my mind into sharp focus, reminding me that even the faintest touch, even an accidental one, could provoke an instant deadly reaction. Marcus's hands hovered, tense, unwilling to move, mirroring my own. We were frozen, prisoners of obedience in a living, breathing abyss. Hours, or perhaps only minutes, passed with the sub quivering under pressure, every nerve screaming in anticipation. I repeated Rule 11 like a mantra, willing both of us to remain unbroken. The shadows outside danced, coiled, stretched impossibly long, and I realized the abyss was learning, testing the limits of our discipline. Any contact would be fatal. Even the slightest slip could make the trench its prey. Marcus finally exhaled slowly, trembling, as the rule sank into his understanding. Nothing touches back here unless death is waiting. Then, without warning, a long curling shape surged alongside the sub, brushing the hull in a deliberate, probing sweep. I froze, breath caught, pulse pounding, whispering Rule 11 under my breath, like a lifeline. The water rippled, almost sentient, pressing against us in ways that defied physics. I could feel Marcus stiffen beside me, body tense, eyes wide, and I realized that the abyss didn't just test patience, focus, or awareness. It tested control over instinct itself. One wrong movement, one reflex, one panic, and it would be over. The sub tilted slightly, as if the creature outside was heavier than water itself, brushing in deliberate, teasing motions along the hull. Rule 11 burned in my mind. Do not react, do not flinch, do not allow contact to provoke you. My muscles ached from tension, from resisting every natural urge to fight, to swipe, to shield ourselves. The shadows outside twisted, stretching impossibly, probing, testing, and I understood finally that obedience to this rule was the only thing separating us from becoming part of the abyss. Time stretched endlessly, the shadows moving, like living smoke, brushing and retreating, always testing, always waiting. I whispered Rule 11 again, each repetition a shield against instinct, against fear, against survival itself. Marcus's eyes darted, tracking the impossible shapes outside, and I realized he finally understood the weight of the rule. Contact was lethal, restraint was life, and the abyss had patience beyond comprehension. Every second was a battle, every movement a potential death sentence. By the time the sub stabilized once more, I was trembling, drenched in sweat, every nerve raw with tension. Rule 11 had kept us alive, where instinct might have failed. The shadows lingered beyond the lights, patient, intelligent, deliberate, and I knew the abyss would always remember us. I glanced at Marcus, pale and wide-eyed, and whispered, "If we survive, it's only because we obeyed every rule, every single one." And even as the words left my mouth, I could feel the pressure of the water reminding me that survival was temporary, that the trench's patience was eternal. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.